I have two questions that, if the groups get time over the course of the rest of the meeting, it would be great if they could touch on, otherwise written responses afterwards. And the first is, we heard Mr Keane talking about Macra's proposals in terms of supporting newer and younger entrants into the sector. If the other organisations could articulate if they have proposals that would do that. And the second question is in relation to this debate around genuine farmer. If the organisations have definitions for genuine farmer that might be helpful to this committee in our future deliberations, and whether, for example, the definition in terms of stocking rates that are in place for ANC, whether that would be a sufficient barometer in that regard. On the substance of what we're talking about here, which is essentially the CAP funds and the distribution of same, it is my view, and I'd be interested to hear if the organisations share this view, that the fundamental problem we have here is the EU budget itself. In my view, every one of your members and of our organisations was sold out, and our government agreed to a fundamentally bad deal that saw the proportion allocated to CAP reduced from 37 down to 30% of the overall budget. At the same time, we'll be contributing billions more in net terms into that EU budget. Do you accept that therein lies the fundamental problems? In relation to the issues around redistribution measures, I'm struck by a line in the ICMSA's opening statement. It says, basing a policy on a payment per hectare is very crude. Do you accept that basing payments on the basis of production levels in 2001 is also crude, and that another way had to be found? So when we're talking about redistributive measures, we saw convergence, and we've heard your views on that. The second area, and I've met with a number of your organisations and Irish government officials over many years talking about CAP funding, and every time that convergence was mentioned, the case was cited of the farmer with small holdings but high entitlements. And therefore I was surprised that you weren't all jumping for joy when the front-loaded CRIS payment was proposed at an EU level, because that would in some way alleviate the concerns of those farmers. And I'd like to hear whether or not you support such a measure for precisely those farmers who have been at the forefront of so many concerns over the past number of years. And then the third issue is the issue of capping. And I see, and I welcome in the ICMSA opening statement, and the INHFA have also alluded that they support an upper limit payment of €60,000 without any loopholes. I'd be interested to hear if the other organisations support such a proposition. So we're dealing with a scenario whereby there is a fundamental inequality in terms of the CAP payment system in Ireland. I'd ask if people would accept that. I hear Mr Cullinan saying that he accepts that there is unfairness in the CAP system. Do you accept that there's a problem when there has never been a coherent proposal put forward by the Irish government or any of the Irish main Irish and more established farm organisations as to how to address that inequality and unfairness that is in the system? So let's be clear about it. At the moment, there are young farmers on their land working full time and breaking their back, receiving €180 per hectare in Pillar 1 CAP payments. At the same time, there are people sitting on their backside with their land leased out, receiving several multiples of that in payments based on the production that they were involved in 20 years ago. Now, that to me is a fundamental unfairness. And unless we're able to say, here's our proposals for dealing with it, then I don't think we have credibility just opposing those measures, those three measures, convergence, front-loading and convergent and capping, that actually have been set out to address that. So I want to hear the organisations outlining what it is, their positions in terms of addressing the inequalities and unfairness that have allowed, as have already been said, the Larry Goodmans, the sheiks of this world and others to draw down hundreds of thousands of euros, millions over the lifetime of a cap, while most of the farmers that you all represent are struggling to make ends meet. We need to have definitive proposals as to how we address that, and I'd be interested to hear that. I note that the IFA are protesting this Friday, and listen, I don't like being critical of any farm organisation, and I work with every farm organisation. But in relation to cap talks, I have to say, you're essentially protesting in support of the government's position in the talks. And I have to go back to my opening point in relation to the EU budget. Can I ask, with the benefit of hindsight, would it not have been more appropriate, and would we not have been able to assure that every one of your organisations would have come together had we taken those actions, brought tractors on the street at the time that the EU budget was being agreed on? So rather than protesting in support of the government, actually come out against the sellout by the Irish government and by the EU Commissioner at the time, who actually facilitated the position that we're in here now, where we're essentially fighting over the distribution of a smaller cap cake. I'll leave it at that for now, Chair. Thank you.
Well, I think, Matt, you've asked enough questions to keep us going for 3 or 4 meetings. But anyway, I'll start with Mr. Keane, because he hasn't been in since we opened it up to questions, and I think every president will want to respond to what Deputy Carthy said. So I'll start with Mr. Keane.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Deputy, I welcome your concerns and your outlining of the young farmers' position. I suppose I've touched on that already, but just to reinforce where we're coming from in young farmers, and to touch on your point, well, we find it wholly unacceptable, to follow on from your point, that a young farmer who's taken over farming in the last number of years has made significant investment, has future ambitions to develop the farming enterprise, and yet looks across the ditch or is leasing land from someone who is not actively continually engaged in farming, who has ceased farming for a number of years, but continues to draw entitlements based on active workings that have been over 20 years old. I don't think in any business, if you looked at any business sector across the rest of the economy, I don't think that could be justified at any other stage. In terms of the definition of, and you've touched on it there, in terms of the definition of the active farmer, and we as young farmers are used to being defined, and I suppose the limitations at which there are in terms of the definition of the 5-year rule, which I touched on a little earlier on, Deputy. But in terms of what our definition is of an active farmer to be delivered under the next cap, and we've submitted this on numerous occasions to the department, but in terms of the payments granted for delivering of public goods, the mandatory completion of health and safety programmes, and the implementation of minimal agricultural activity, for example, it's stocking rates, cropping rates set by each individual member state. And a point which we've made on numerous occasions to the Department of Agriculture over the last number of years, as a result of a report which was commissioned by ourselves back in 2017 and 2018 on delivering a continuous professional development programme for farmers to engage with. That framework needs to be set up, and as part of that we can monitor the training and the development of farmers within that professional development framework. And you've touched on it, it was touched on a bit earlier on in terms of succession and succession planning for farmers. But we are strong advocates for the development of a succession scheme which delivers for both older farmers and younger farmers. But it links in with what we've been promoting over the last number of years within our own service in the land mobility, which is a collaborative and partnership approach. And it was touched on earlier on about the penalising nature of previous schemes, whereby the older farmer couldn't appear outside the farm gate or their payments were a threat. We don't see that as being a way forward or a way as being proactive in encouraging both the younger farmers and the older farmers. In terms of capping, and I know you've touched on it there briefly, I think it's important to note Knocker in support of the 60,000 cap, with the proviso that it's taken into account of the labour units incurred on the farm. Because if we look at young farmers who are taking over and developing farms, particularly over this period of time, it's important to note that the growth in the business, the development in the business, and how that's going to be supported through payments, and simply capping it at 60,000 without taking cognizance of the impact that might have on the financial viability of the enterprise is something which needs to be addressed. And I think your final comments around ensuring that the future and ensuring that the budget is not necessarily enough, we'd firmly agree on that the overall budget for the CAP hasn't been enough. This is the hand that we're dealt, and it's ensuring that there is a future for young farmers there and that supports are ring-fenced is crucially important. Thank you to Chairman and thank you, Deputy.
Okay, Mr. Connan.
Thank you, Chairman and Deputy Carthy. Yeah, a number of questions there. I suppose the first one on new entrants, and I think that we need to combine that with the genuine farmer and the definition of that, and the leasing of entitlements as well. And look, we've been very clear on this, and we always advocate generational renewal, and it's important in any sector that you have young blood coming into the sector. That's critical. And I suppose where we're going to get funding for there, like, we have to look at, particularly in the long-term leasing, if that land is being leased, the entitlements are being leased out, well then there needs to be an option given to that person to sell on those entitlements. I would advocate as well, that the government needs to come in there with the capital gains allowance, that there would be a tax-free incentive there on the lump sum. And I'd just like to say on that as well, it was mentioned earlier about a retirement scheme. And I think that would go a long way towards a retirement scheme for a person who wants to give up farming as well, and continue to lease out their lands, and the rental income is tax-free. I think that's where we will go with that one. And Deputy spoke about the genuine farmer. As I said earlier, I think what we want to look at there is, there is activity on the farm, and whether it's the financial output that it be from doing accounts, what's coming out of the farm, or based it on sales, there needs to be a minimum sales or minimum activity from a farm. I think that's absolutely critical. And I suppose, look, you spoke there about convergence. We need to just stand back and look at where we're at the moment. Like, we have convergence, we have eco schemes, and up to and including last week, when the negotiations reconvened last week, at that point in time, CRIS was a voluntary measure for member states, right? And so what we're saying here is that needs to stay a voluntary measure, and it's up to a member state to consider and make a decision around that. And you put in capping there as well. So if you put all of those measures in, this is a massive change in redistributing funding right across the board. And look, we're clear on capping as well. We don't want to see funding going to Larry Goodman or the sheiks. Absolutely, we agree with that. And it needs to be, as I said at the beginning here today, it needs to be for the genuine farmer that's doing the work. But when we look at all what's coming down the tracks at the moment, particularly with the convergence, the eco schemes, and how those eco schemes are going to be developed, and our farmers need to get rewarded, because remember, it is the money that he's been taking out from the farmer in the eco scheme that was there to support the farmer for producing cheap food, and it's been turned into environmental measure. So at a minimum, a farmer has to get back the amount of money that has been taken out, and definitely should be rewarded if they are doing more. You spoke, Deputy, about IFA's position on the budget, and I think I was very clear. I can go back to last July, and we were very, very clear that absolutely there wasn't enough in the budget, because when we look at what has happened here, with all the greening measures, the Green Deal and the impact of all of that, there needed to be an increase in that budget. And was it a sellout? Well, look, the budget is what it is, and as I say, we were not satisfied with the budget at the time. And you spoke there about IFA taking action now. Well, the reason we haven't taken action up to now, as we all know, last July we were in the midst of COVID, and there was a slight break in COVID at the time, but no way was I going to put my members at risk at the time going out onto the streets, albeit, look, we were very, very frustrated. But I think we have to look at the budget. Like, it wasn't last July the problem arose with the budget. Like, the budget has been decreasing since 2001, and there has been a massive decrease, like from 50% down to 32%. That's where the budget is at, and that has been eroded over time, and obviously it is a major concern for us.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. McCormack.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. And look, I suppose, Deputy Carthy, in fairness, when we talk about new entrants, and when I spoke about them earlier, an exit mechanism for the farmer, because land availability is the one thing that new entrants will always say prohibits them from starting out, whether it's a long-term lease or indeed the inheritance of a farm. You know, if you look back to the late 90s, the retirement schemes of that period were very, very efficient and very successful in transferring land from one generation to the next on either a long-term lease or a permanent basis. As regards the redistribution model, and you know, you talked about the payment per hectare being a crude way, and you know it is, because while it has merits, and idealistically, you know, the envelope needs to be taken into account. And I'll unashamedly say that, because if we're to protect the family farm structures that are out there, and they're only hanging in by a thread, some of them right across all sectors, including dairying, we need to take into account the overall payment, because there's no point in seeing an individual family farm with 8 to 16 or 10 to 20,000 or whatever the case may be of a single farm payment lose substantial sums of money to beneficiaries who may actually have their land let. And you know, that's the critical point. The critical word actually in the cap reform, and God knows in other times we often sat across the table from you in Brussels talking about the active farmer, but none of us succeeded in clinching the deal as regards what the active farmer was or wasn't. In fact, we probably made more ground on what it wasn't than what it was. But the genuine farmer, if we can get that right, I think a lot of people will be happy. The actual genuine farmer, because, you know, there's no point in, I'll give an example and it's a bit extreme. You could see a farmer who's renting ground from a landowner, and that farmer could see themselves cut in payments under the convergence model. And the landowner would increase maybe in payment as a retired farmer under the convergence model, because they're still letting their payment or their entitlements with the land tax-free, and if they have a below the national average, they'll find themselves increasing. That has to be wrong. You talked about it being historical payment, and you know, is it right to have it on a payment that was on an activity that was almost 20 years ago? Well, certainly is it right that you'd have a beneficiary who may not have farmed in the last 8, 10, 12 years, may have their ground let? No, it's not. That's absolutely farcical. But look, as regards to CRIS payment and that, I might hand over to my colleague John Enright. He's sitting there, and I know he's anxious to get in and to contribute as well.
Okay, Mr. Enright.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I suppose just our concerns around the CRIS, Deputy Carthy, would be, firstly, I think Colin mentioned 22 million there from capping earlier on, and we support capping in our payments. Like, if 22 million is equivalent to 176 euros per farmer, you know, that's the reality of it. So, you know, if there is going to be an effective CRIS payment, you're going to talk about a linear cut across every farmer's payment. And what we have said very clearly on that is there needs to be a clear analysis of what that means to every farmer. You know, you could have unintended consequences on this, and it's important to point out that people with very high payments have been mentioned earlier on in the presentation. They're going to qualify under CRIS as well. The very same as a farmer with €1,000, a person with €100,000, €200,000 is going to qualify under CRIS. So what we've said is there needs to be a clear analysis. And, you know, we have said that the convergence is crude, and it is crude. You know, the reality is, and our President said it, a person who's not farming at all, has all their entitlements leased, will gain under convergence in many cases. Farmers who are getting €10,000 will see their payment cut in order to increase a payment to somebody on 35, 40, 50,000 euros. So if that's not crude, I'm not sure what is. In our submission, we have set out clearly what we believe details in relation to what is a genuine farmer. We've said that the ANC minimum stock intensity should be applied. We've also said that, you know, a farmer should have a certain level of output from his or her farm. So, you know, we have set out exactly in our submission what should be done in relation to that. And in relation to generational renewal, we've also set out in our submission that there needs to be programmes under Pillar 2 which aren't there at the present time, both for the young farmer coming in and the old farmer retiring, if we're serious about it. You know, I think I'll leave it at that, but I think, you know, they're the important points.